On Samsung's website, you can buy the A42 5G for 400. Wait, that's the A53 5G. In fact, you can't buy this 2020 mid-range device anymore, and honestly, Samsung's doing you a favor. Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, the person that dislikes budget and mid-range new phones for a few reasons. But there is some good to the Samsung A42 5G, so let's go over it. To start, this is a budget phone. Technically it's considered a mid-range phone, but it's a budget phone. The price ranges, but let's just say when this was new, it was $400. Absolutely terrible pricing by a long shot. While it was a decent price to the competition, it being the same as the iPhone SE and $100 cheaper than the Pixel 4a 5G, it was also worse than both of those two phones. But it's not 2020 anymore, and you can really only find this phone used. Going to Swappo, we find some prices in the range of about $90 to $125 for a used version, which is more like it. But then that makes this phone simply a disposable phone with some perks. Currently, screens can be found for about $60, batteries $11, and charging ports $15. This means that if something breaks on your phone, you can actually fix it yourself for a reasonable price. Compare that to a Samsung S9 Plus, which can be bought for around the same price of over $125. And while the battery and port are going to be about the same price to fix, the screen will cost over $100 just for you to buy the part. Not to mention the back is glass, so you have a higher chance of breaking that compared to the plastic one on the A42 5G. So if you break your phone a lot, or you're hard on it, maybe a phone like this would actually make it worth it. But I did pick the Samsung S9 Plus for a few reasons. It's a phone that has a higher resolution screen, better build, stereo speakers, and even a telephoto sensor. But there's no 5G, there's less built-in storage, and the software support ended at Android 10. And for some reason, the Samsung A42 5G lacks an always-on display, while the Samsung S9 Plus had one, even going back to the Samsung S7. But with all that said, these new budget and mid-range phones aren't entirely terrible. I mean, this phone just got One UI 5.1 and Android 13, something that I just got on my Z Fold 3. With that said, Android 13 is probably going to be the last major software update that this phone gets. But that's perfectly fine in my eyes. Part of the phone's cost has to go to paying software developers to make the software, right? Moving into the phone, what does roughly $100 get you now? Well, the Snapdragon 750G chip powers this phone with 4GB of RAM and 128GB of UFS storage that is expandable. To put this in perspective, this is essentially like a power-efficient Snapdragon 845 chip, or Samsung S9 Plus, just with 30 to 40% performance decreases on the graphics. Playing games on the Nothing phone was okay, but on this phone it chugs on demanding games. To be fair, normal usage is okay. I did notice that leaving an app open would kind of slow down the phone for some reason, like if you were watching a 20-minute YouTube video and then you leave, it would cause the phone to really not know what's happening. Kind of like what I was experiencing on the Vivo Y01. I do wish that this chip was close to the Snapdragon 765G chip, but it just isn't, and Samsung's software experience doesn't really help that. This phone might have worked better at launch, but with all these software updates, they might actually be ruining the performance. The storage does help though, being fairly fast and never really being a part of the waiting game. This isn't really a phone for those that just need to talk and text, but you can have some apps on here. Speaking of texting, you do realize how annoying that vibrating motor is when you do start typing. It's so mushy, just terrible. You can use the onboard storage to get a few gigabytes of virtual RAM, which is actually fine because this phone does feature a micro SD card slot, and it even has a headset jack. To power this phone, we get the 5000 mAh battery, which allows for 15 watts of wired charging and a decent amount of screen on time, probably maxing out at about 8 to 10 hours. Of course, this is because of the processor that slows down the phone and seems to be capping the power consumption. Lastly, we get Bluetooth 5.0, 5G support, obviously, and an in-screen fingerprint scanner, which is just not good. I would heavily rely on the Face Unlock if I were you. This is a fairly large phone and weighs about 193 grams thanks to that large battery. But moving to the outside of the phone, the back is plastic. There is a square for the camera area that may or may not have a flash in it, depending on which market you buy this phone in. The top is where the microphone is, and the left is where the SIM and SD card slot is, while the right side is where the volume and power buttons are. On the bottom, that's where we get the headset jack, another microphone, the USB-C 2.0 port, and the only loudspeaker. Yep, that's not a top loudspeaker, it's just an earpiece. The front has a fairly nice flat OLED panel that is 6.6 inches at 720p and has a 60Hz refresh rate. It's not really the best screen at all, and that refresh rate is a little bit disappointing, but the brightness does max out at about 400 nits, so brightness shouldn't be a huge issue. The lack of the second loudspeaker is disappointing, just like that U drop for the front camera. It's a 13 megapixel sensor that looks, well, like a 13 megapixel sensor. You get 1080p at 30 frames per second for video, which is not too surprising, and a bunch of modes that just make this phone feel cheaper than it should be. As for the rear, we get a main 48 megapixel sensor, while the ultra-wide is an 8 megapixel sensor. The image quality is pretty similar, which I guess is nice, just the images are passable, nothing special. Lastly, there is a 2 megapixel depth sensor, which probably makes your shots look worse than not having it at all, and that's just for the US version. Some overseas versions of this phone may have a 5 megapixel depth sensor and actually have another 5 megapixel macro camera. I don't know why they did that. Those also include a 20 megapixel front camera over the 13 that we get here. Either way, video maxes out at 4K 30 frames per second on the ultra wide and the standard sensor on the back. There's no 60 frames per second out of any camera for some reason, regardless of the quality. The shots, again, are passable, but when lacking optical image stabilization and just the fact that this phone is a cheap phone, don't expect the camera to win any prizes. To be fair, the phone's performance won't win any prizes either. I knew I was going to be rough on this phone, but truly, I'm not sure what phone I could recommend over this phone. Bring that budget up to $200 and you can pick up a Pixel 6 or an LG V60. But at that strict $100 price point, this really is what comes in at that price. This is what happens with some budget phones. I show you how they don't really hold up after 2 or 3 years, and other flagship phones become more reasonable in prices. But the reality of it is that the Samsung S10 would be a better phone, but that only goes to Android 12 and will have miserable battery life compared to the A42 5G. Not to mention the lack of 5G in that S10. Should you spend more money for a better phone? Absolutely. Is this one of the most affordable 5G phones out right now? Absolutely. While I'm not a fan of this phone, I can respect that this mid-range phone dropped into a budget price, but it's a fairly good value. With that said, I can tell you for a fact that this headset jack having phone lacks a water resistance rating. This one in particular actually suffered some liquid damage, but I revived it. I wanted to keep this video short because I felt that this phone isn't really worth the money, but honestly, there could be a reason for you to buy this phone. I would say the look and the SD card slot, but you may say that it's because of the overall value of this phone. So should you buy this phone? Probably not, but it's definitely worth considering. And that's my review of the Samsung A42 5G, the NPC phone that's actually not the worst. But what do you think about this phone? Is there more to it than what I said, or will this be lost and forgotten soon? Let me know what you think, and as always, thanks for watching.